Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for September 18th, 2020. And on this episode, I'm talking about George Washington's farewell address. He had a ton of warnings, a ton of great stuff in there, and I'm going to share with you what I see as the top 3 warnings that he gave: cherish public credit, usurpation, and factions. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Boldin. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is where you can find everything you need to follow this show. All the platforms are on, both video and audio. All the archives that we've done for over 2 years. And on individual episodes, I include links to reference material in the show notes so you can read, watch, listen, and learn more on your own time. You can even find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Look, I could not be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this done in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And I want to start out with this really cool image that I was able to dig up for those of you watching on video. Tomorrow in history, September 19th, 1796, George Washington published his farewell address. It was actually a written document. It wasn't a speech, so he published it personally in the American Daily Advertiser with the title, and this is a pretty cool title, "The Address of General Washington to the People of the United States on His Declining of the Presidency of the United States." And to me, it's just kind of amazing how he put that. But you can see it pulled up here. I'll see if I can include a link, or maybe I can include that image in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, so you can check it out on your own time. But I wanted to point out a couple of things. First of all, this was almost immediately republished, and it was read widely all across in all the states. But it wasn't written solely by George Washington. In fact, in 1792, he was actually planning to step down after just one term. He didn't really want to stay there for a second one. But he saw a lot of factions, a lot of problems going on, even in his own cabinet, and he felt that they needed his leadership to get them through those troubled times in the early part of the Republic. So in the summer of 1792, he actually asked James Madison to help him put this together. And I'm going to include a link to this. I won't cover it here right now. I might actually do this next year, go over some comparisons. But Madison actually drafted it originally in June of 1792. And then when it came time for round 2, Washington actually took that draft and gave some additional notes and sent it to Alexander Hamilton, and then there was some back and forth between he and Hamilton to come up with the final copy. The final version was actually written by Washington, but putting together notes between all 3 of them and under his direction, of course. There's also something I'm going to include in a link to the show in the show notes. From WashingtonPapers.org. This is an overview of that history that I think you'll find interesting. But anyways, let's get right to this and go to the top 3 warnings, at least according to my opinion, from Washington's farewell address. And I want to start out with number 1. That is, cherish public credit. Now, he's not just talking about spending, but there's a reason to do that, and hopefully you'll get it from his words. He writes, as a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. In other words, if you want your country to be strong, you don't run into huge debts where you have to always be, subservient to someone else at some point. Someone's going to come collecting at some point. And of course, you may need that credit in times of crisis. Washington goes on, he says, one method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace. So he's encouraging peace, avoiding war, going for peace as a way to ensure that the country had good, strong credit in order to have strength and security. He goes on, he says, avoid likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned. not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Unfortunately, that's not how people do things today. They're always kicking the can down the road, running up huge deficits and debts in order for someone down the line to carry the bill. And that will have to be paid eventually. But Washington warned against this. It makes a country weak. Number 3 is cherish public credit. Number 2 is usurpation. For those of you who listen to the show or watch it regularly, you've heard me use this word many times, and I use it over and over because the founding generation was so familiar with it. And the founders and ratifiers, the framers, the drafters, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were all quite well aware of the term usurpation. It was understood in general as when government exercises power not delegated to it. It is then stealing, it is usurping, it is stealing sovereign power from the people of the several states. It's doing something it never by right is authorized to do. In fact, St. George Tucker in 1803 referred to usurpation as treason against the sovereignty of the people. Now, Washington, in this part of his farewell address, he's talking about the checks and balances. He thinks it's a very important part of the structure of the Constitution. But he points out that maybe people want to change things down the line. And he says, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. So if you don't like the powers delegated to the federal government, there is a mechanism there to do something about it, to change it, to expand or restrict those powers. However, but he warns against doing something else, and that is usurpation. And he puts it this way, but let there be no change by usurpation. In other words, don't just exercise the powers. Don't just do something new because you need to do it. And he talks about the short-term goal that many people today have. He says, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. And basically he's saying, like, look, even if you like the short-term outcome, if you like the political results, maybe even if you like the person doing it, you think the results are good, it's the instrument of good, as he put it, it's still the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. We have many warnings from many founders and old revolutionaries who talked about this as well through history, but Washington really hammered it home. He says the precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. That's number 2. So number 3 is cherish public credit. Number 2 is usurpation. And number 1 is factions. And he's talking about the dangers of factions on a state level, and then he goes in to expand that. And he writes, let me now take a more comprehensive view. And mind you, Washington wasn't a bombastic speaker or writer at all. Didn't use a lot of aggressive language, we'll call it that way. But he says, let me warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. And that must have really hit home to a lot of people reading this, because that for him to warn like that was a big deal. And this is how he put it. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. A frightful despotism is the domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge. And that's what happens when you have party over principle rather than principle over party. He says this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. Why? Maybe he was prophetic. But here's how he put it. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. We always end up with more centralization of power, is what he warned us, when you focus primarily on faction. One faction or another, one individual leading one over another, eventually people will look to that. And he says, and sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition into the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. And he sums this up, and I just want to include this as well. He says, without looking forward to an extremity of this kind. At the time, he was concerned about factions. Of course, he stayed an extra term primarily or partly because of his concern over this type of spirit of revenge and the power of factions at his time. But he didn't think it was going to end up like this in the short term, but he was thinking big picture, long term, maybe for the times we live in today. And certainly this is a warning that has been ignored. He says, it still nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight. So think long term. He says, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. I think that's a good summary right there in George Washington's own words. I hope you guys found this an interesting episode. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. If you support what we're doing here, you support the show, you like the TAC, you can do a few things that are absolutely free to support us and help get the word out. Smash the like button, leave a review on iTunes or any other podcast platform, subscribe, get bell notifications, comments, sharing links, all of that stuff that you do on all these platforms. It tells the algorithm of the platform you watch or listen on that you're interested, and it should show the program to more people. And it has really been helping us reach new people week in and week out. Thank you so much for doing that. And I know we always have a number of members here during the live and even in the archive as well. We could not get the job done without the financial faith and support of our members. If you are able to consider it, we keep it as low price as possible. You can start out as little as $2 a month, and you can join us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us. Again, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great weekend ahead of you. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.